Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's great to have you with us at this webinar format book launch for the recently published Spectres of Fascism. Before I go on to introduce our panel and talk about the format and so on, I should just introduce myself briefly. My name is Tamir and I'm the director of the Institute for the Humanities, the editor of this book, which came out of an Institute for the Humanities project, which I'll talk about in just a second. Before I go any further, though, I'd like to say that this event is, in a sense, being hosted, not taking place fully, but being hosted on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. I would like a big thank you to Huyen Pham, who's the program assistant at the Institute and has been for about 6 years, for all the work that she's done over the years, but especially putting this together. The logistics have been complicated, to say the least, not just because of the technical issues, but also just coordinating different time zones and so on. So thank you very much, Huyen, for your efforts. Just a word about the book itself. It comes out of free school that we hosted at the Institute for about a year in 2017, and it was geared specifically to address the global trend towards authoritarianism. And a number of the contributors, I'd say the majority of the contributors to the book, spoke at the free school, taught a class, so to speak, but not everybody. And one of the speakers who was invited, or one of the panelists today who was invited to contribute a chapter, is Tamir Baron, who I will introduce in just a second. So the idea of the free school was to create a context in which we could address this global trend. And I think one of the distinctive aspects of the book is it really looks at the rise of authoritarianism and its spread in a global perspective. Typically, you have discussions of authoritarianism focusing on what's happening down south, the United Kingdom, around the Brexit referendum, and also, of course, the trend towards the far right in Europe. But what we try to do here is provide a really global perspective. So what I'd like to do next is just to introduce our panelists and talk about a bit about the format. And I'll introduce all of our panelists first. First off, we have Ingo Schmidt, who teaches labor studies at Athabasca University, whose recent books include Reading Capital Today, Marx After 150 Years, and that's with Carlo Finelli, and The Three Worlds of Social Democracy, A Global View. Next up, we have Jaleh Mansoor, who is associate professor of art history at UBC. Her areas of teaching and research include modernism and the avant-gardes, European art since 1945, Marxism and the Frankfurt School, formalism, Marxist feminism, social reproduction theory. A very old and good friend that I've known since graduate school days, who is a researcher and professor in the School of Social Sciences and Government at Tech de Monterrey, and is a specialist on the French and European New Right, fascism, the right in various countries, the history of political ideologies, the alt-right, Islamism, terrorism, and not least football. Which is to say soccer and the right. So welcome to all of you. Really looking forward to an excellent set of discussions. So the format will be as follows. We'll each have more or less 20 minutes to speak a little bit about the book and our contributions, and then also to try and extrapolate a bit from this work to talk about the current situation. It seems that since we had our free school about 3 years ago, things have only gotten worse in a sense. There's been a kind of deepening of the shift to the right, and now under the conditions of the COVID-19 pandemic, there's an even greater tendency in that direction. At the same time, the pandemic does represent a certain kind of an opening for progressive response to renewed forms of class struggle and organization. Although, of course, under lockdown, these things are very difficult. So we're living in a time that's just rife with various kinds of contradictions. So what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit to set up the panel based on a piece that I'm just finishing up for the LA Review of Books, which in a way tries to do this. It takes the introduction and extrapolates in some fashion to try and understand our current situation. I shouldn't be really too long with this, but I do want to refer to the text a bit, and then I will move the discussion to the other panelists, and we'll open up for comments and questions. I would like to just let people know that we'll take all the questions at the end of the panel discussions. So once Tamir has finished his presentation, then we can address any aspect of the panel. So just a few words then. We have been haunted by ghosts of fascism that have returned from the 20th century crypts over the past several years, if not decades. With the global COVID-19 pandemic today, however, we are perhaps confronted with the uncanny return of what could be regarded as our Reichstag fire moment. The Reichstag fire was an arson attack on the German legislature exactly 4 weeks after Adolf Hitler was sworn in as chancellor, allegedly carried out by Marinus van der Lubbe, a Dutch council communist, and the Nazis immediately claimed that it was a result of a communist plot to violently seize the means of production in the state apparatus. Ironically, this event became the quintessential false flag or pretext for the Nazi seizure of power and the process of the total coordination of the state, suspension of the constitution, and so on. As has been recently pointed out on April 23rd by The Economist, close to a dozen states from Azerbaijan to Togo have used the pandemic to arrogate more power to themselves. Indeed, this development has been particularly evident in Washington, Budapest, and Delhi. And I'd single out Budapest in particular, where the government of Viktor Orban has pretty much suspended the legislative branch of government, and it's now a kind of rule by decree. So these are troubling developments, but does this mean that we are faced with fascism? So when we had the free school, there was quite a heated discussion about whether we would name it Spectres of Fascism. It seemed at that time maybe a little bit of a provocation. However, as it turns out, it wasn't really a provocation at all. It seemed to name certain tendencies that now have seemed to escalate. But nonetheless, there's a big danger in saying, look, this is a return to the moment of Weimar, the moment of the 1930s. And there's several reasons why we should not regard it as such. It's not simply a repetition of this moment, not least the fact that we aren't seeing the development of authoritarian politics on the basis of a failed revolution. I don't think you could make that case. Even if you look at Occupy and the Arab Spring and so on, this is not like the revolutionary moment in the post-October Revolution period, where you had a wave of revolutionary uprising and fascism as a kind of last bastion to maintain the capitalist order as a response. However, one discussion that I think is quite valuable, and I know Ingo has some disagreement with me here, which we might bring out later in the discussion, and that is Samir Amin's interesting and also provocative discussion in 2014 about what comprises fascism, how we can understand it in the 21st century. And he says it's essentially comprised of two things. The first is fascism responds to a crisis of capitalism. And the second is it's a categorical, that is to say, across the board rejection of democracy. And I would say there are aspects of this definition that are quite valuable. However, there are a couple of refinements that are possibly in order here. One is that crisis can no longer be thought of as discrete and episodic, so to speak, acute. Crisis, as we have seen under neoliberalism, tends to be generalized and atmospheric, and one could say it's like a syndrome. It's chronic. Crisis is chronic. So that means neoliberalism always seems to falter around these times of crises. But if it falls, it always falls forward. That is to say, the response to the crisis of neoliberalism is more austerity, which is to say more neoliberalism, which is to say then more crisis. So we're locked in this kind of permanent cycle of crisis. So I think these I think are quite important to keep in mind, these two dimensions. And this is a kind of context in which we can understand the return of fascism. So the second dimension that requires some rethinking is that fascism isn't a categorical rejection of democracy per se, but a rejection of liberal democracy. So we see this again in Hungary, the arrogation to itself of executive power in the government of Viktor Orban, attacks on courts, attacks on the principle of the free press, and essentially attempts to limit executive authority and make it accountable. These sorts of things are under attack. But one of the things that really distinguishes, you could say, the contemporary form of what's being called the post-fascism of the 20th century is that what remains in place, at least for now, are elections. Although even then we are on the brink of possibly something new and very dangerous, insofar as the COVID-19 pandemic has led to the musing of Jared Kushner about the possibility of a cancellation or postponement of the November election. He was quickly criticized for this and walked it back, but this is indicative, I think, of some of the thinking in the White House. Trump said quite steadfastly that the election will go forward. However, at the same time, as we know in the last couple of days, he's been very critical of mail-in ballots. He's worried about fraud and so on. So the messaging is contradictory, and it's, I think, quite alarming. Because if we then move beyond elections, if we see a kind of relegation of legislatures to, essentially, well, you see a kind of suspension of the legislature in Hungary, then we're onto something quite new and quite different and extremely alarming. And that's when it makes even more sense to look at historical analogies without collapsing them. So I just want to end on this. Yet as dire as the situation may be, there are hopeful signs of growing labor militancy, as was recently demonstrated by striking workers at Amazon, Instacart, Shipped, Whole Foods, and so on. And this was on May Day, who protested what they considered to be their employers' woefully inadequate responses to the pandemic. The global health emergency has, moreover, demonstrated that the integrity of societies cannot be indexed to the prosperity and well-being of its most affluent, but most indigent members. So society must be fundamentally restructured. It has decisively shown that healthcare cannot be tied to conditions of employment, but must be considered, as Bernie Sanders repeated over and over again, it must be considered a basic human right. It has highlighted the dangerous illusions of possessive individualism on which the shifting sands of the entire neoliberal order rests. It has seriously revived with great urgency discussions of the admittedly fraught and contested idea of universal basic income. This is something that John Clark in Toronto has been saying for some time, a very critical basic income. But nonetheless, it is on the table. The pandemic has doubtless, as I've argued, constituted an opening for further authoritarian consolidation of power, but at the same time, it has opened a space for imagining a very different kind of society. Now, I think this is the crucial point. Which path we take will be a matter of organizing, which is to say a matter of politics. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Ingo Schmidt.
Thanks very much, Samir. Good morning, everybody, or good day, depending on the time zone you're in. And Samir already alluded to Weimar and to Hitler. So it seems impossible to talk about fascism without mentioning Hitler and Mussolini. Those are the classical cases. They are used as a kind of a cheap benchmark in political discussions. If you don't agree with somebody you call him or her fascist. And if you want to be apologetic about somebody, you say, well, they don't wear brown or black shirts, so obviously they are not fascists. There's plenty of debate like that. It's a bit disturbing. It doesn't help very much clarifying things. But being the classical cases of fascism, just like the French and Russian revolutions were the classical cases for democratic and socialist revolutions respectively, it's impossible not to take them as a key point of reference in our efforts to understand right-wing tendencies today. And I would argue, this is my point of departure, that one can use Hitler and Mussolini as scientifically grounded benchmarks for our discussions of fascism. And to do so, I will focus on Marxist theories of classical fascism, as I find them very helpful, not only to understand what's been going on back in the 1920s and 1930s, but also what's going on today. However, unlike most Marxist debates, which are very much about identifying your favorite theory and the strategy that comes with it, looking for the one and only, and then endlessly arguing about my Marxist theory is better than yours, which doesn't help very much politically either, I would argue that actually the various currents of Marxist theories of fascism are very much complementary, building on each other. And having said that, I will very briefly go through economic, sociological, and psychological perspectives to understand past, actual, and potential fascisms and the way we think about them and the ways we can hopefully fight them. So let's start with economics. The classical theory put forward mostly by Comintern comrades was that there was a general crisis of a general crisis of capitalism in the early 20th century. This was not just the cyclical up and down that we call the business cycle. It was a general crisis, meaning capitalism was on the verge of being replaced by something else, possibly. And this brought forward or brought out the most reactionary factions of capital, seeking to avoid this overthrowing of capitalism, and they turned to fascism in order to do so. This was the Comintern line, the most reactionary factions of capital turning to fascism, and those factions in the day, back in the day, were finance, capital, and heavy industries. Essentially the guys who would build Hitler's Wehrmacht, give credit for it, and try to steal money and resources from other countries to pay for the whole imperialist effort. Now, not having much time, we just jump from those crises into today's world. And in a way, the crises that we are seeing today are much more Marxian than they were back in the day of the Comintern. Capitalism is much more dominant in today's world than it was back then. We have a much more pure capitalism than in the early 20th century, when crisis actually started by imperialist powers fighting over access to, at the time, non-capitalist territories. This conflict, as we all know, led to a war. It led to the Russian Revolution, which in turn led to the establishment of the Soviet Union, which economically meant that the world market started to shrink, but also that there was a non-capitalist alternative, which was perceived, and I think rightly so, as a death threat to capitalism back in the day. This is obviously very different today. Capitalist rule is more universal than it was back then. No non-capitalist alternative to speak of does exist. So one wonders where the crisis comes from, and I think one answer is given in Karl Marx's Das Kapital. There are internal contradictions, and we could discuss them endlessly if we wanted to, that lead capitalist accumulation into crisis, but there's also ecological limits to accumulation. And these two combined, the internal contradictions of capitalism and ecological limits, I think very much determine the kind of crisis that we are seeing today. And like in the early 20th century, we see divisions in the ruling class between different factions of capital, let's say between green capital and fossil capital, between Elon Musk and the Koch brothers, so to speak. So there is some instability there, and I'd be careful to say this is all neoliberalism. I think there's important divisions within the ruling classes, and neoliberal ideology has lost most of its currency, and the gap left by, or the vacuum left behind by neoliberal ideology is actually the rise of fascism, or the spectres of fascism. Now, moving on to my next point, sociology. Austro-Marxists, Trotskyists, Brandlerites all pointed out, criticizing Comintern theories, but also building on them. They did not challenge the idea that there was a general crisis of capitalism, but they did point out that, yes, there is a socialist challenge, there are organized working classes, and if capitalists want to defend their class privilege, maintain the capitalist order of exploitation and suppression, they also need to have a mass organization. They need a mass basis, they need to mass organize. And the middle classes, impoverished by economic crisis, not only following 1929, but also already the inflationary crisis following World War I, led to an impoverished, radicalized middle class, which became the core of the mass basis of historical classical fascism, even though the fascists also attracted people from all other classes, including segments of the working classes. Now, this whole thinking about class today sounds a bit iffy. It's not common language as it was back in the day, and a key reason for that is that neoliberal restructuring of the global economy led first to a recomposition of working classes, which led to the disorganization of working classes as we knew them in the past. And that left a vacuum on the left, which was largely filled ideologically by a libertarian left. And as much as historical fascism, just think of the Nazi flag, a red flag, just instead of hammer and sickle, they put in a swastika. Today's right-wing organizations are response to the libertarian left, and their preferred targets are feminists and environmentalists. Today's far right represents there the stormtroopers of fossil capital. why they hate feminists so much, I will come to in a short moment. But even though there is a lot of identity politics going on, coming out of the, let's say, cultural 1968 New Left, and then being completely taken over by the racists and sexists on the far right, today's right-wingers are also fiercely opposed to the remnants of the old labor movement, which is the welfare state, or what is left of it after rounds and rounds and rounds of austerity and neoliberal unmaking of the welfare state. And I will come back to the role of the welfare state in my concluding remarks, but will now move on to my final level of analysis, which is psychology. Now, so far I talked about crisis. Objectively, things are changing, the need to mass organize, but to organize, you need to convince people to follow your whichever political line you're advocating for. Ultimately, people have to decide, as it was suggested in an old labor song, they have to answer the question, which side are you on? And back in the 1920s, just as today, many are on the side of the right. And there is a current of left-wing thinking, which I will broadly call Freudo-Marxist, which gives answers to these questions, disturbing answers, because they are so good, so to speak. And these answers revolve around two ideas, I would say. One is the fear of freedom. Capitalism destroyed all old securities, as repressive as feudalism might have been. Kind of everybody knew their place in society, and all that was challenged with capitalism, and which became particularly problematic in a moment of crisis when there was no orientation whatsoever. And inevitably, people start wishing the old days back, even though the old days were not as great as they seem to be in hindsight. And the other element is repressed sexuality, which just kind of caught people in a hierarchical order, which led to sexist behaviors. And this kind of behavior was reinforced back in the day by schools and the church. And found kind of a vent in fascism, because that allowed you to turn your repressed sexuality in a drive to conquer foreign countries and rape women and murder men in those countries. Now, this analysis today sounds a bit churches and schools. Churches have lost much of their currency. Yes, there's mass media, television, right-wing schools, churches, but they don't have the same influence that they had in the early 20th century. Schools have changed beyond recognition since those days. Teachers are not beating their children like their students like they did then. And sexual repression, one might think, can't exist today because we had the sexual revolution of 1968. However, it seems to me that what the sexual revolution produced was to a significant degree what my good old friend, if I may say that, Herbert Marcuse called repressive desublimation. And I think this led to a situation where in today's world, there's not so much fear of freedom, there is more a fear of not being competitive. Because we are so free and increasingly also freed of all social securities that were provided by the welfare state, that many of us might like the idea of freedom, but also get a sense probably we belong to the 99% who will drown in the competitive world market rather than make it. And this, I believe, has a sexual aspect too, and this is where the hate against feminists, I believe, comes from completely different from the world that Wilhelm Reich, who came up with these ideas about sexual repression and explaining historical fascism. We have the mass commodification of sexuality. Porn industry is one of the largest industries in the world, but I think it did not lead to a liberated sexuality where sexuality expresses joy of life. I think it just reinforces the idea that I may not be able to live up to the standards defined by that industry. And this is, I believe, the recognition or the hunch that you might not live up to those standards invites people to hate feminists. It's a deflection, of course, from the captains, the tycoons running the porn industry, exploiting thousands of women. Then you turn it against feminists. Not different in a way or similar to the Nazis identifying the Jews as their preferred scapegoat. And this goes hand in hand with the stormtroopers of fossil capitalism. You have to open the economy. I'm physically based in Hope, British Columbia, but the university I work for is headquartered in Alberta, so I know what I'm talking, what fossil counter-revolution is. It is this quest for unlimited access, and if there is an environmentalist, worst case, a woman like Greta Thunberg, or if there's First Nations people blocking pipeline projects, they have to violently be moved out of the way. And I think there's a lot of psychology going on. Nothing represents, I believe, the good old days as much as the automobile. It was the liberation. You can go anywhere. Clearly, as a way of life, there's sexual connotations to the use of cars also. It really represents the good old days that seem to be threatened by Greta Thunberg coming along and saying, well, how about you ride a bike? How do I end here? I'm ending up in the gloomy pictures that I always dislike in this kind of Freudo-Marxist discourse, because what it does so well is explains us why people, even though they might not be the ones benefiting from fascist policies, they still follow those policies and staff the ranks of those mass movements. But the problem I have with that is coming back to you have to answer the question, which side are you on? Yes, focusing on psychological repression and how it turns people into pursuing self-destructive policies is certainly true. But it's also true that both in the 1920s and 30s and today, there were also masses of people who gave a different answer to the question, which side are you on? Yes, the labor movement in Germany was defeated in the 1930s, but it doesn't mean that the majority of the German working class were followers of the Nazis. And in other countries, we had the popular fronts in Spain and in France. We had the union mass organizing in the United States and Canada, and actually overcoming racist barriers. It was black and white organizing, so racism was actively fought against in those days also. And in today's world, it seems almost forgotten now that just 2 months ago, it's Friday, it's almost Friday noon, where I am at least, the time where for weeks, even here in small little Hope, we had Fridays for future protests, and there were millions around the world coming out for these protests, and whatever shortcoming one might find in those protests, it clearly indicated there is a desire to build a better world, a different world, and that has been transformed, I believe, into some of the responses during the corona crisis, all of a sudden people do understand what is essential and what is not. And essential is to have healthcare, to have food, and to have housing. And we have movements of solidarity. We have workers' strikes. We have debates about basic income support. So I think as much as we have to understand why people turn to the right, there's also opportunities, kind of a reordering of preferences to build a better world. And being in hope, I always say this, I'm hopeful that we can succeed in that. And with that one, thank you very much.
Am I correct in assuming that we're now moving on to Jaleh?
Yes.
Okay. You have the floor.
Thank you. Okay, I am trying to share my screen. And as ever, at the very moment where I'm attempting to do that, I experience issues. So thank you for bearing with me and your patience. There we go. Okay. So for this volume, which first of all, I'd like to say I'm so honored to be included in this, and I'm really delighted for the publication of this volume. I think the world needs it. And I'm very happy to hear that Tamir will be sharing part of the introduction in the LA Review of Books. I'm just grateful all around. So for this volume, I tasked myself to try and parse through historical instances of fascism through cultural production, because that's what I do. I'm an art historian. I don't necessarily trust myself to move into political history, economic history, or political economy. So I took this as an opportunity toward answering whether we are experiencing the recrudescence of fascism, because I was part of those conversations at Unit Pit, and I do remember that was the most heated kind of conversation, whether we were seeing a repetition or something else. So I thought one way to answer that would be to look back at the avant-gardes of the interwar period. And I looked at, of course, Weimar culture. I'm showing you on the right one of the most classical instances of fascist culture production. This is a sculptural work by Arno Breker entitled Readiness, dating to 1939. And this sculptor was a great favorite of Goebbels and Hitler, and his work is, of course, monumentalized in the Nazi Museum in Germany. And on the other side, I'm showing you one of the classical exemplary manifestations of Italian futurism. This is Umberto Boccioni's Walking Man, dating to 1913, but then reiterated in the 1930s in various other sort of more wealthy materials. It was initially cast in plaster and then later in bronze. I'm trying to look at my notes here because I can't share my screen and my notes at the same time. So what I found tremendously interesting in attempting to compare these two classical instances of fascism in the history of culture in the 20th century is, of course, that Italian futurism is a much more internally differentiated and heterogeneous case. So you have the loudest spokesperson for the movement, of course, F.T. Marinetti, whose manifesto, founding manifesto of futurism, was published in 1909 in various mainstream media outlets. It was published in Figaro, it was published in French newspapers, and then you have the sort of less vocal, but certainly equally productive members who ran the range from being in agreement with Marinetti to being on the opposite side of the spectrum. So you have figures like Carlo Carrà, who openly identified with Italian anarchism in the tradition of Malatesta, until, of course, he was browbeaten into silence, which is, of course, when he sort of gives in, gives up, is defeated, and then returns to his return to order phase in the 1930s. So Italian futurism struck me as a really interesting case. So back to Marinetti for a moment. What I found fascinating about Marinetti is that he continually appeals to, he writes a letter to Adolf Hitler, which is, of course, monumentalized in all of the collections around the discourse of Italian futurism, where he complains that his stance, his words, and the cultural production of his movement aren't being recognized by the German National Socialists or fascists. He feels continually ostracized and left out, even though his work is, of course, recognized and celebrated by Mussolini. So that already is a signal that historical fascism is a kind of highly, as I said, internally differentiated sort of case of fascisms within the larger picture of fascism. So that led me to try and arrive at a kind of etiology for how to describe those differences. And before I move on, I should also say that the images that I have on the screen are the two kind of paradigmatic cases of fascism within the historical avant-garde. But of course, that if we were to make a Klein diagram or to try and map it diagrammatically, it's already much more complex than that, because of course, figures who identified with communism, for instance, in the Russian and Soviet context, we have Roman Jakobson, who also identifies as a futurist and who was in quite a rich conversation with Marinetti and the other futurists. And then in the French context, we have Guillaume Apollinaire, who is credited in all of the discourse as being part of the kind of founding matrix of Dada, which is associated with a leftist critique of authoritarianism. So, you know, we have quite a cultural map there. So, of course, in my attempt to come up with something more solid, I fell back in the last instance to all of the cliches about the differentiation between the Italian context and the German context, and the reason for which the Nazis, Hitler himself, and Goebbels, which I must say as an aside, was quite interested in culture production. Goebbels curated the Entartet Kunst exhibit in Munich in 1937, in which he gathered together quite impressively, as a curator, I would add, all of the sort of key paradigmatic manifestations of the avant-garde. So Kurt Schwitters is in there as an exemplar of German Dada, as is expressionism, as is constructivism. So Goebbels had his finger on the pulse and his ear to the ground in terms of what the avant-garde was producing. So unfortunately, in the last instance, I fall back on what is already the kind of discursive line, which is, of course, that Italian futurism, true to its name, tried to expunge, excise anything that could be deemed passéiste. Anything that would be mimetic, representational, traditional, returning to history. Whereas, of course, the fascists in Germany were busy updating, upgrading historical instances. So, of course, Arno Brecker's readiness is a very poor, if you look at contrapposto and the base, you will see that, you know, any art historian could argue that Arno Breker is not understanding what it is that makes Michelangelo so special. The kind of update on Greek classical contrapposto, he sort of messes that up. But at the same time, he's copying Michelangelo's David's face, but he's making it hypertrophic. It's a kind of David on steroids. It's upgraded and a kind of Franken David. And of course, the sword that Brecker's sculpture is holding is a kind of phallic compensation for the Davids. There's a lot of discourse about how Michelangelo sort of metonomically displaced the sort of phallic presence of the David into the figure's hand and into the totality of the figure, rather than representing genitals per se. That's changed in the Nazi case. But I'm not interested really in summarizing and reiterating my argument. Anyone can read it. I'm more interested in the conclusions that I came to in the essay and in my conversation with Tamir, and that I would like to raise today. So in this essay, I worked a great deal with Walter Benjamin's famous declaration that leftist politics entail the politicization of aesthetics, whereas fascist and right-wing politics entail the aestheticization of politics. Now, I understand, having worked with Frankfurt School theory for, you know, the better part of 25 years now, I understand the context, the motivation, the reasons for Benjamin's very important declaration. But I've come to the conclusion that that declaration is descriptive of a particular moment in history, and it has come to be co-opted discursively as prescriptive, and that has become very problematic because it has in effect declawed and defanged many generations of political manifestation that are really too afraid to mobilize a proper aesthetics into the service, if you will. I'm not really interested in the instrumentalization of aesthetics. The long and short of it is that after having concluded this essay, I turned again to a theorist that I had worked with a great deal in my 20s and 30s, and then had come to sort of reject, but I'm interested in again, Jacques Rancière, who is really, I think, the key figure in sparring with this kind of Benjaminian dialectic. Rancière would argue that politics and aesthetics are already a priori bound, that aesthetics isn't necessarily tasked to be representationally political, but in its quasi-autonomy, it is already political. And that, you know, politics isn't necessarily a science. It might be a kind of art. So returning to, you know, the person who put art with a capital A as opposed to arts and crafts in general, the person who has theorized art as such is, of course, Immanuel Kant's Critique of Judgment, published in 1790, in which he argues that aesthetics should be on par with, equal to, in our esteem, with the sciences, but they are constitutively different. It's a different way of knowing the world, probing the world. And I wonder, because, you know, several decades of politics, certainly in the United States, and I would argue probably elsewhere, have been using aesthetics in the service of a right. Whereas, well, there is no leftist politics, really, electoral politics in the United States, with the exception of Bernie Sanders. But there's a kind of real anxiety, a real fear of mobilizing aesthetic manifestations on the part of the left. But to sort of, I don't need to digress, to return to what I have on the screen here, this way in which Arno Breker is effectively saying, let's make art great again. Let's return to the sort of cradle of mimetic representational perfection, which is the Renaissance. And that is what not only fascist aesthetics, but indeed the fascists themselves. I've been, at Tamir's recommendation, been rereading a excellent book on reactionary modernisms by Herf, in which he makes the case that the fascists were the best at co-opting a kind of German romanticism that looks to a pastoral past, even though it too is accelerating in a kind of techno-futuristic way, right? Mass media, Hitler on the radio, film, Leni Riefenstahl filming the Olympics, etc. But it's always under the aegis of a return. So this is, of course, you know, resonating with Trump and friends, make America great again, even though Trump has never been able to give us or afford us a proper picture of when America was at its greatest, presumably between 1949 and 1973, when, you know, the wage was at its highest, the economy was booming, the sort of golden era of the United States. But he doesn't state it as such, right? He doesn't turn it into a political science. He doesn't give us a kind of rational narrative. Instead, it's sort of purely aesthetic. So I don't want to take too much of the floor, because I'm more interested in a conversation with the other panelists and with our audience. But I would say for the present and into the future, I would caution against too strict a kind of binary or too undialectical, in the last instance, of a dialectic between aesthetics and politics, because within history, aesthetics has been political in other ways besides German National Socialism and fascism. You know, Rancière himself points to the reenactment of the storming of the Winter Palace in 1920, which is, of course, itself an aestheticization of a politics that has already come to pass, right? That is the sort of prefiguration of a movement in art that we see in the 90s and in the 2000s of reenactments. You know, Jeremy Deller's numerous reenactments are sort of looking to that reenactment of the 1920s. So while I hold firmly to the classical paradigms that we have, I think that history itself has sort of, right, I agree with that sort of Hegelian notion of history, where contradiction is a kind of motor. And I think that we have long surpassed that Benjaminian binary, and it would perhaps do us well as activists, theorists, writers, whoever we are, to try and rethink the sort of aesthetic toolkit available to us as we mobilize, as we find one another in our anti-fascist aspirations. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jaleh. There's plenty of food for thought there, and I look forward to getting on to the questions and the discussion. But before we do, of course, we are now ready to hear from Tamir Baron. So Tamir, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Samir. I appreciate it. And I want to also thank Ingo and Jaleh and Simon Fraser for the invitation. I am going to try and share the screen as well. Okay. Does everyone see that okay?
Yeah.
All right. So I want to begin by thanking Simon Fraser University's Institute for the Humanities again, and for inviting me to speak about the right, the radical right, extreme right, fascism, and post-fascism. I would suggest that it would do us all a service to define those aforementioned terms. Now, I'll try just with one of them, which is the right. So if we follow Norberto Bobbio from 1996, there is, and I quote, a very clear distinction between the right and the left, for which the ideal of equality has always been the pole star, that's the end of the quote, that guides the left. Paul Gottfried, the co-inventor of the term alt-right with Richard Spencer, distinguishes right and left by arguing that, and I quote, the difference that comes to mind most readily centers on equality. The left favors the principle, while the right regards it as an unhealthy obsession, end of quote. In short, inequalities between individuals and groups are natural for the right and socially created for the left. Now, I would suggest that definitions matter because it might turn out that some intellectuals, movements, or regimes that we classify as fascists do not actually fit the bill. If this is the case, do we not diminish the horrors of authentic fascist regimes? Furthermore, it's clear that not all those on the right are automatically fascist. Yet, if we see this very interesting quote by the self-declared French neo-fascist author Maurice Bardèche, who would influence the metapolitical turn of the French New Right, could it be that fascism was reborn after 1945 with, and I quote from Bardèche, another name, another face, and really with only some of the traits of the fascism of the interwar years? Now, we should keep those comments in mind when we discuss the alt-right and French New Right, otherwise known as the Nouvelle Droite, and sometimes also known as the European New Right, to distinguish it from the Anglo-American New Right. Now, these two men on the slide are the leading public intellectuals associated with the French New Right and alt-right respectively, Alain de Benoit and Richard B. Spencer. Those two metapolitical movements were created in very different historical contexts, countries, and epochs. The French New Right was created by ultra-nationalists in the aftermath of the Algerian decolonization process and the rise of the New Left and student and worker protests in 1968. The May 68 protests in France and the cultural power of the New Left led the French New Right to the view that an anti-liberal revolution is possible in democracies without actually using violence. De Benoit thus pioneered what became known as a right-wing Gramscianism, a path that led to a primary anti-liberalism and vehement anti-capitalism in the 1980s and 1990s, as highlighted by his collaboration with Telos, support for what Alberto Spektorowski, the Israeli historian, calls a multiculturalism of the right, and a valorization of direct democracy with a decidedly anti-immigrant regionalist or nationalist basis. The alt-right, on the other hand, was largely created online as a reaction to the election of the first Black President, Barack Obama, in 2008. Its leading intellectuals include the likes of now the deceased Samuel Francis, Jared Taylor, his heir apparent, Greg Johnson, and of course, the public face of the alt-right, Richard B. Spencer. Now, according to George Hawley, the term alt-right is, and I quote, exclusively associated with white racial politics. The movement, of course, makes headlines in 2016, the year when Donald Trump was elected US president, and becomes especially infamous during the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. Okay, so what I want to do here is fourfold. I want to suggest, following my article in Samir's excellent edited volume, whether the alt-right and French New Right are kindred movements. So I want to pose that question. Now, why should we even care, secondly, about metapolitical movements that are essentially devoted to the propagation of ideas? Thirdly, I want to look a little bit about whether there's been a consolidation of authoritarianism in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in particular, I'll focus on radical right-wing intellectuals in my answer here. And number four, I want to look at whether we have a new opening for radical left-wing politics as well, because of the current crisis. Okay, so are the alt-right and French New Right kindred movements? In 1985, von Bain suggested that there were 9 familles spirituelles, or spiritual families, or ideological groups amongst the different political parties in Western Europe, including on the extreme right. Now, although the alt-right and French New Right are not political parties, but rather metapolitical movements, we might ask whether these two metapolitical movements are, and I quote from the piece, cousins not based on blood, but in the ideological sense. Now, of course, there are differences between the respective leaders of the two movements. For example, Spencer's greater disdain for leftism, his support for the right to bear arms, and his openly race-based and anti-Semitic worldview. We have to remember, de Benoit is already engaged in a metapolitical struggle since 1968 and can now count on openly anti-immigrant political parties as a normal part of European political life. And that's a good thing for de Benoit, because for de Benoit, if you look at his manifesto, first published in 1999 and then in English in 2000, he comes out very clearly against immigration. Yet by analyzing the respective manifestos of the two movements, I show that the French New Right and alt-right are both on the revolutionary right. They want to root and branch, destroy liberal democracy and multiculturalism, and arguably capitalism. They focus on a titanic cultural war against what they call globalist liberal left elites. They support restrictive immigration and the erection of a post-liberal order based on a more homogeneous, I would say white, European identities. Thus, in short, the French New Right and alt-right can objectively cooperate in order to destroy their number one enemy, liberalism, and its ethos of egalitarianism, that is, the legacies of the American and French revolutions. Now, why should we care? Why do these metapolitical movements matter? Well, I would argue that the alt-right follows in the metapolitical footsteps of the French New Right. As noted in this memorable quote from de Benoit, what the French New Right has created and what the alt-right continues is a Leninism and a Gramscianism of the right. In the alt-right manifestos, Spencer notes that he is waging on, and I quote, ideological war on those deconstructing European history and identity, and against the decrepit values of Woodstock and Wall Street. The alt-right is thus the latest incarnation of the radical right's long-standing metapolitical struggle or cultural war against liberal and leftist elites on both sides of the Atlantic. The phrase cultural war, I might add, is equivalent to metapolitics and is borrowed from the Swedish thinker Daniel Friberg, a leading alt-right collaborator. Just like the French New Right in another epoch, the alt-right should be taken seriously by the liberal establishment, by the general public, and I would argue leftist cultural elites for 5 main reasons. Number one, its right-wing Gramscianism borrows from the French New Right. This means that it is engaged in a larger Euro-American metapolitical struggle to change hearts and minds on issues related to white nationalism, racialism, the survival of the white majority, the demographic growth of non-white communities, the creation of white ethno-states, alleged Jewish power, and the ills of liberal democracy, globalization, multiculturalism, immigration, and capitalism. Number two, we forget that the alt-right is indebted itself also to the evolution of sectors of the violent neo-Nazi and earlier white nationalist movements in the United States of America. Its metapolitical struggle is in principle nonviolent. That is, with the caveat that some of its supporters have been engaged in violence. I cite Dylan Roof, for example, and I cite Charlottesville as another example. It reshapes the historical image of the US radical right away from the Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazism, Christian identity, and other like-minded white supremacist ideologies with a penchant for conspicuous displays of violence, racism, and pro-imperialist and pro-colonialist longings. Number three, this metapolitical orientation uses the media to reach and influence the masses of Americans. In short, it makes issues of white nationalism, racialism, immigration, multiculturalism, and anti-Semitism mainstream and potentially acceptable to more Americans. Number four, the cultural war means that Spencer, de Benoit, or Friberg that I mentioned earlier, the alt-right collaborator, see themselves as a type of Leninist vanguard on the radical right, which borrow from left-wing authors such as Gramsci and left-wing positions in order to one day win the metapolitical struggle against liberal and left-wing elites. And number five, this cultural war, we should have no qualms by saying it, is intellectually and philosophically sophisticated because it understands the crucial role of culture in destabilizing liberal society and makes use of very important philosophers in Western culture, Friedrich Nietzsche, Carl Schmidt, Ernst Jünger, Julius Evola, most of which had pro-fascist or pro-Nazi leanings or participated in the case of Schmidt as the crown jurist of the Nazis. So these philosophers are used in order to give credence to its revolutionary, racialist, anti-egalitarian, and anti-liberal ideals. So has there been a consolidation of authoritarianism in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic? My answer is yes, without a doubt, and I would echo some of the things Samir had said. This rising authoritarianism extends to regimes on the right, and the very few that still exists on the left, some of those regimes, I would say. Yet I want to focus my answer on intellectuals of the radical right. Steve Bannon, once in the White House, the special advisor to President Trump, saw in the crisis, and I quote, the inability of states to erect meaningful borders regulating movement of people and the production of goods. De Benoit recently wrote a piece in Telos about COVID-19, in which he argued, and I quote, the health crisis is ringing provisionally the death knell of globalization and the hegemonic ideology of progress. He also notes that closed borders are now being applauded by all political stripes, and that the liberal dream is, and I quote, that collective identities would be progressively eradicated and sovereignty would become obsolete. He invokes, of course, Schmidt, one of his mentors, to tell us that in a state of exception, I quote, norms can no longer be applied. In this respect, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán used the crisis to suspend entry of migrants into Hungary's 2 transit zones with Serbia and passed an act to extend his government's emergency legislation and rule by decree. Richard Spencer of the alt-right could tweet in April that the pandemic makes people, and I quote, inherently more tribalist and nationalist, realistic and inward-looking. Okay, there's a lot going on there, I realize that. By the way, those are the influences, I would argue, of the French New Right. The right-wing ones on my right here, and the left-wing ones on the left, okay? You probably get the left ones, okay? Che Guevara, Marcuse, Marx, and Gramsci. That's Nietzsche, that's Ernst Jünger, and that's Maurice Bardèche. And of course, what's linking them here is May 68. They are born, the French New Right is born in 68, and they of course have all this envy for the cultural power of the left and the new left at that time. So yes, there is certainly an opening for the radical left because of the increasingly desperate material conditions of ordinary people worldwide. However, how will the left respond to a radical right that increasingly battles in the realm of ideas, not just in the streets or not just in parliaments? After all, Gramsci, an Italian Marxist, is now a hero for the radical right. De Benoit, Spencer, Freeberg, and Paul Gottfried all sing his praises. Gottfried was a student of Marcuse, the new left guru. He could claim, and I quote, that some of the major influences on my thought have come from the classical left, and recommended Gramsci's prison notebooks as, I quote, a primer for power relations because of its focus on the worldviews of dominant classes. Radical right leaders from Orban in Hungary to Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil are in power in various countries around the world. The radical right is now an integral part of the European party system. And the radical right is very adept at using the cultural realm in order to advance its decidedly anti-liberal ideals. It was Gramsci who exhorted the left to take the cultural realm seriously. It is here that the future of a political system is decided, the site where the mental revolution takes place before the political revolution occurs, and the terrain where new perspectives and practicable utopias are constructed. For these reasons, a new left, and I would add without that very bad name, a new left, is waiting to be born. This will mean paying attention to Gramsci, building think tanks, crafting new manifestos, devoting ceaseless energies to the cultural realm, and taking the internet by storm. This is what the radical right is doing extremely well. The effects of such a long-term metapolitical project will ultimately only be noticed decades later. Thank you very much. Thank you for all those in the audience for listening in. That's my contact, and I've shared this presentation with the Institute, and I thank you for having me again, and I look forward to a discussion with all of you.
Thanks very much, Tamir. Fascinating presentation, and I think lots to be learned, it seems, from the French New Right, to be sure. So I think now we can go to some questions. The audience has been very patient, has listened to us now for close to, well, it's about an hour and a half or so. I mean, obviously we had a bit of a hiatus, but I would like to first go to the audience, and one of the early questions came from Sid Shihad, who put a question up immediately following Ingo's presentation, and that has to do with whether or not neoliberalism has been discredited. This is a claim that you make in your presentation, Ingo, and is this actually the case? This is Sid's question.
Sorry, can you repeat, because I was reading a comment here?
Yeah, sure. Has neoliberalism in fact been discredited? Because it seemed to be what you were suggesting, that this is really the kind of last stake in the heart of neoliberalism, which, you know, in some way echoes what we've already heard in Tamir's presentation from those on the alt-right, for example. What's your view?
I think ideologically, as an idea that would capture the imagination across class boundaries, neoliberalism is done for. It was the promise. It actually had co-opted quite successfully new left ideas about liberation. I agree that equality is a key idea on the left, but so is liberty and freedom. And neoliberalism had captured that and presented actually the welfare state and the Soviet Union as the anti-libertarian incarnations, the road either actually existing serfdom or the welfare state being on the road to serfdom. That was very powerful. What we just heard about the struggle of ideas around the French New Right and the alt-right had also been done by neoliberals, and this is completely gone. And on the matter, more concrete governance level, what we are seeing with central banks printing money endlessly, you might visit Milton Friedman's grave and ask him what he thinks about that. He's rotating constantly. The only thing that remains from it, but that existed long before neoliberalism, is austerity. If there's an economic crisis, just make sure you make the working classes of the world pay for it. That's not very neoliberal, it's essential capitalism in all its incarnations. However, having said that neoliberalism as an ideology is pretty much done, doesn't mean there is the new big idea. We really live in a hybrid, like the 1920s and 30s, area where the fading ideas of neoliberalism compete with the rising ideas suggested by the far right, the spectre of fascism. But yes, there's also the spectre of a new left. Bernie Sanders mobilized so many people, even if you don't agree with his approach to socialism, that so many people came to his rallies is indicative that we're in an open situation.
In taking the cultural route to form the new left, How do the panelists see this new left in countering social media filters? It's very often that in social media that fascist content float around. See a lot, but leftist pages are flagged and taken down quickly. And how can the new leftist movement counter this, aside from being tech savvy? I'd just like to add something to this question, because it points to some larger issues. And it seems to me that one of the key aspects of our own cultural situation is identity politics. And it seems that you have a kind of left version of identity politics, and then a right version, which is identitarianism, white nationalism, kind of, redoubled forms of European identity Europa, and so on. It seems that identity politics works as a means for a new form, a new reprehensible form of solidarity on the right, whereas on the left, it seems to be really divisive. And I think the question about social media filters and so on has something to do with this, if I understand the question correctly. There's a lot of gatekeeping, there's a lot of infighting, there's a lot of policing that seems to happen around identity politics, or motivated by identity politics, particularly in the sphere of art and aesthetics. So I'd be very interested to hear what the panelists think about this, and we'll go to other questions in a minute. So just feel free to jump in.
If I hear correctly, that might be addressed to me. I just replied to one of the questions. I believe it was Donna who asked me about memes. But to your question of social media, I think that hooks on to my conclusion that sadly the left has sort of been declawed of the mobilization of aesthetics, whereas the left has the right has unconsciously and intuitively embraced it in order to sort of propagate its doo-doo. And I would say the same of the internet. I would place the internet in a sort of broader space of aesthetics. The internet might be, I had initially titled my essay before I switched it that we are in the future of the futurists. The futurists would have loved the internet. The right futurists, Marinetti, the left futurists, Jacobson, the sort of Mallarmean capacity of the internet to sort of disidentify and re-identify the reading order, the correlation between image, music, and text, I think would have been embraced by the avant-garde. But sadly, the right has sort of intuitively figured out how to play with transparency, opacity, gatekeeping, whereas the left has just been incredibly naive. We know that Bannon used the internet, used the dark web. So the sort of succinct way of answering Samir's query would be to say that the internet is precisely what I have in mind when I think of this expanded field of aesthetics that might have been effectively politicized by the left much, much earlier, beginning in the early 90s, and that we've kind of sadly missed that boat, but that doesn't mean that can't change. So yeah, it seems to me that the right really knows how to spy on the left, but make itself invisible, whereas the left has kind of drank the Kool-Aid of this Habermasian notion of transparency, where it hasn't really managed to shield itself, to mask itself, and deploy, if you will, those sort of dark arts, with the exception of microscopic movements in Europe. And I would turn to Agamben, not Agamben himself, but his graduate students who started the movement Tikkun and sort of tried to marry Debord and Italian feminism into this kind of movement. in a sense, that's their entire banner. That's their entire rallying cry. That the left has to understand how to deploy the relationship between opacity and transparency and aesthetics as effectively as the right has.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm just as a kind of follow-up, and again, this is to all of the panelists, but I think in particular to Tamir, in terms of this question about the right learning from and borrowing from the left, and it seems as if one of the things that characterized the 20th century avant-garde up to and including the Situationist International was a certain kind of politics of transgression. It seems today the left is very worried about transgression. It wants to, in a sense, it has become, in a sense, the moralistic transgressed against. And the right has seen this as a perfect opportunity. I think this is one of the reasons why the right has gone after free speech so concertedly, because it knows the left is in this kind of mindset of wanting to police expression so much, so it kind of performs its own kind of undermining of the left by getting it to betray what has historically been its a key sort of principle. I mean, most notably in the 20th century at Berkeley. Any thoughts about that? Before we go on to take other questions.
Very interesting question, Samir. Look, I'm gonna give you an answer that's gonna relate to some personal experiences in academia, and maybe those experiences might shed light on this moralism that you're talking about, this conformity that I have seen. Yes, I would say on the left, and that is, for example, I remember when I first wrote my "Where Have All the Fascists Gone?" and I was giving talks, and I would incessantly at academic talks get the question, "Are you a fascist?" You know, so we can't study this thing. We're not allowed to study it. Just by studying it, you're labeled. And I would get it constantly. And I do think that it hurt my opportunities. I really do. And now, whereas we should really be studying it, we put up a barrier. So I want to know, which side are you on? If you're on my side, that's okay. So that's extremely problematic for the vigorous exchange of ideas, which we all need. Now, fast forward to when I'm teaching already in Mexico, 2014. So the Journal for the Study of Radicalism, it's run by Arthur Versluis. He contacts me. He says, "I've invited de Benoit to write a piece. Do you want to respond?" Oh no, first, yeah, okay. But first, I had written a piece. On the French New Right. Then he contacted him. De Benoit says, "Yes, I'm responding." And I write a 50-page response. And people were like, you know, I spoke to a few colleagues that I would consider on the left, and they didn't particularly like it. It's like, you're talking to a fascist, you're talking to a neo-fascist, like, how could you, you know? And just read the piece. It's like, do I agree with everything I said there at that time? I'm not sure. Was it polemical? Holy cow, was it polemical on my part and de Benoit's part? But that's interesting in itself. And so I think we're doing ourselves a disservice by not delving into their worldviews, not understanding the radical right, by putting up these barriers. And I should add one final case, because I like him a lot, is Benjamin Teitelbaum. And he's written a new book about War for Eternity. It's 2020. It's about Steve Bannon and the rise of traditionalism worldwide. And he's interviewed all these kind of alt-right traditionalists. And Teitelbaum is an anthropologist, and he basically says, you know what? I don't give a damn. I'm going to be their friends. So, which is, I don't go. I wouldn't do that. That's not my approach. But his point is, he befriended Freiberg even. He befriended a lot of white nationalists. And I would argue he has some very interesting insights when it comes to really understanding these people. And isn't that what we're trying to do?
Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating. I think I should move on to some further questions. So there's a couple of questions here from Sven Robinson, who is a very important, long-standing figure on the left within the NDP. And he has one question in particular for Ingo, which has to do with the fact that, Ingo, you address, and you probably have seen the question there, but again, I'm just going to verbalize. You address the anti-feminist and misogynist dimensions of fascism, but you don't get into the important question of homophobia and transphobia within fascism, and particularly its psychological dimensions. And then the second question is that we, as academics, and this is directed at the panel as a whole, we are talking about authoritarianism, and at the same time, this phenomena really affects the poorest and most vulnerable communities the most. So, given our relative positions of privilege, how might we use that privilege, or how do we see ourselves in relationship to our own privilege in mounting a fight against this authoritarianism? So perhaps, Ingo, you'd like to start, and then others can answer that second part of the question, or let's say the second question.
Right. I'm not sure whether I said it in the mic or wrote it in some response, how neoliberals co-opted the ideas of liberation from the new left. And this includes all forms of sexuality, including gay, lesbian, transgender issues. And neoliberals actually kind of came to terms with them. It doesn't stand in their way of how they see the world works, as long as it's global enough to always make sure there is a cheap labor power available. It doesn't matter who people share their beds with. And that was, of course, a major shift. I mentioned the differences between the 1920s and 1930s, which was still very much shaped by pre-capitalist ideas, which the then existing capitalists had adopted, controlling women's bodies to give birth. So they wanted kind of to have control. How many workers, how many soldiers would there be? And of course, there's different threats to that kind of control. One is abortion, and the other is homosexuality, because with homosexuality, there's this threat that there isn't the abundance of cheap labor power and potential soldiers. And the new right is, I think, particular with its idea that they, meaning non-whites, reproducing like crazy, and whites under the spell of feminism, having all the abortion clinics and all being gay and refusing to produce good little white babies. That's a major issue for the new right. Like every newborn baby, I mean, we live in the age of Malthus again, right? There's too many people, but mostly it's them, whether they're brown or yellow, all non-whites, there's too many of them, but too few whites. So we have to close the abortion clinics, and we have to go after the homosexuals to make sure good straight white people make sure there's enough of us to defend ourselves against the onslaught of the Chinese-produced coronavirus and all the non-white immigrants stealing our wealth. That would be my short answer.
Thank
And
you. Go ahead.
on the question of academic privilege, it's kind of interesting to live in a small town like Hope, where probably we are kind of part of the upper class. We have steady incomes, my partner and I, and most people around us, they are self-employed. And we try to do some organizing around Fridays for Future here. And it's difficult because many leftists, academic leftists, say class doesn't matter anymore. If you talk to people who have no steady income, kind of they, on the one hand, they envy you, on the one hand, for the same reason they hate you. And if you talk politics with them and you say something about saving Mother Earth, very quickly it's kind of, oh, it's easy for you to say that because you just wait for your next paycheck automatically coming in. But we have nothing all other than the hope that they eventually build the Trans Mountain Pipeline and we get some paychecks for that, even if it's only for a couple of months. So it's extremely difficult. All I can say is don't hide your social position. People figure it out so easily, and if you try to hide it and kind of pose as the rough working class person that you're not, you just come across completely ridiculous and not accountable.
Yeah, it would seem as well that this is one of the reasons for a further discussion of the Green New Deal and ways of conceiving of a transition away from a carbon-based economy. And that's something, again, as you know, as intellectuals, as academics, we can help along. And I would just add to, you know, or I would present an answer in terms of also, no matter how difficult the time is now that we're experiencing, how difficult things will be for the university. I mean, in Manitoba, people may be aware of this, some people may not. The provincial government there is asking universities to model 10, 20, and up to 30% cuts to budgets. So this cuts well into flesh and bone of the institution, and I think this is a very dangerous time potentially for universities. But I think universities are still important because, I mean, especially, I mean, of course, I think they're important, but I think one of the fundamental principles that's now being eroded within the university is that of academic freedom, because of the external pressures coming through, you know, decades of reductions in public funding. And there's more requirement for private donors to step up, and as we know, you know, he who pays the piper calls the tune often, and so those are the kinds of pressures. So I think we need to defend academic freedom, but we also have to defend. And people might or might not know that I have also, you know, defended in particular sorts of ways free speech and expression. And I think this is also, especially in this time, very important, but also very fraught and dangerous. That relates, I think, a little bit to Tamir's previous answer to the question that was posed. Would anybody else like to, Jaleh or Tamir, would you like to add to this question? Yeah, please.
I see in the comments on the webinar chat about Nietzsche, and I just want to clarify that. Yes, Nietzsche is not you know, a supporter of German nationalism or anti-Semitism, open anti-Semitism. I never suggested that. What I was suggesting is that Nietzsche, I think, links a lot of figures on the radical right precisely because of his anti-egalitarianism, his love of elitism, his love of hierarchy, his love of ancient hierarchical societies and those values as a counterweight to kind of modern egalitarian ideals. So often the French New Right and the alt-right would say basically that liberal ideals or even socialist ideals are a continuation of the egalitarian ideals of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And you know, this critique, in fact, was is a critique that they borrowed from Nietzsche, his critique of the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Yeah, I think that's an important clarification. It really was his sister and brother-in-law who recruited Nietzsche into a kind of proto-fascistic milieu, but he was an anti-Semite. He was a good European, a bad German, and so I think that's important. But it also brings to mind the fact that as the right has been learning from the left again has been learning a lot from the right. There's been quite an appropriation or attempted appropriation of figures like Carl Schmidt from the left, and not just Telos, which has certainly turned to the right and had done so quite some time ago, and probably in the late 80s, with a kind of populist turn to not just Schmidt but Junger, and then of course de Benoit and the French New Right. But also there's a kind of left Nietzscheism. There's a left Heideggerianism in France in the post-68 period, and I think that's also very interesting. These kinds of changing of places and so on. Jaleh, did you want to just come in on this this most recent question, or should we move?
Oh, I don't think that I have anything to add.
All right.
Thank you. Okay,
thank you. So we have a question from Judith Friederike Popp. I think it is important to think about questions such as, can one be a fascist today without being a populist? I think this is a fascinating question. So is, let's say, fascism, does it have as a condition of possibility, or maybe a necessary, if not sufficient condition, a form of populism? Who would like to take that on?
Well, you want to go, Tamir?
Go ahead, Ingo, and then Tamir.
Go ahead, Ingo. No, go. You go for it.
Come in.
I'm an economist, so I like simple formulas. I would say every fascist is a populist, but not every populist is a fascist. Populism was defined, and many leftists have criticized that as a thin ideology, but I think it's quite a proper definition, making clear kind of, it appeals to a broadly us and them, and the us and them can then be filled in very different ways. From there is clearly a road to class politics. Us is the working class, them is the capitalist class, but it can also be filled with us is the Aryans, and them is everybody subhuman. And everything, there's all kinds of mixes between that too. Remember that the Nazis themselves called themselves the National Socialist Workers' Party. So I think the rise of populist movements indicates the falling apart of a once hegemonic idea, which is neoliberalism, free market views of the world. And that has since been filled up in different ways. Many people, and I think rightly so, describe Bernie Sanders as a left populist. I would agree with that. And actually, I have no problems with that at all. But if you're fascist, you have to be populist because you have to reach some kind of mass mobilization. But you are trying to drag the populism in a certain direction, just as Bernie Sanders did in the opposite direction.
Thank you, Ingo. Tamir, please.
Thank you, Samir and Ingo. So yeah, I would agree that there are certainly left-wing variants of populism, and Latin America is a primary example here, as well as more right-wing versions. And we should think of Peronism, which Stanley Payne actually suggested was a form of populism, and that is the historian Stanley Payne, and a form of fascism as well, one of the most successful outside of Europe. I should also allude to the definition of the historian Roger Griffin, at Oxford Brookes University. He's written a lot of very good stuff about fascism, and his definition might be illuminating, and I'm paraphrasing it, of course. Fascism as a form of populist, palingenetic, that's a mouthful, ultranationalism. Palingenetic meaning the rebirth, and the ultranationalism is the rebirth of the nation from periods of demise, from multiple crises. And using kind of the language of the people, using populist language.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. And I think we could also turn the discussion in the direction of this question of equality. So to sort of reframe what I think what you've earlier drawn attention to, Tamir, and Ingo's more recent intervention, we can understand the crux of populism is a logic of us and them through which the idea of the people is constituted. You could say that the right tends to personalize this us and them. There's a particular concrete enemy against which the people is defined, and that's on the backdrop of a defense of natural inequality. Right, whereas the left tends to, the left populists, not just Sanders but Podemos, you could say, Corbyn, the Corbyn moment in the Labour Party, the idea of for the many and not the few. You have a structural understanding of the way in which the people's aspirations for a better life, more control over their lives through democratic representation, redistribution of wealth, and so on. This gets articulated in an egalitarian and an inclusive kind of way. And I think this is important because I think there's been a tendency on the left to do exactly what Ingo was not doing, which is to say to dismiss a kind of left populism. And I think that the argument in favor of speaking its language is that there's the possibility of winning over from the right to the left those who are attracted to a certain kind of populist discourse. So I think this is probably still something we ought to be thinking about in terms of your programmatic suggestion, Tamir, of a kind of new left. This ought to be still part of the discussion. So now we have another question, and I think this is for Tamir from Barbara Moyas. You can see that up there, Tamir, but I will read it out. You have mentioned that the far right relates liberal egalitarianism to the Judeo-Christian tradition. Historically, white nationalist discourse has in many cases been shaped by Christian understandings of difference. Given that, I was wondering whether and how the far right uses the Christian tradition to legitimize their claims vis-a-vis liberalism in the cases you study. Very interesting question.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. Very interesting question. Now, so I would suggest that the figures that I was looking at, in particular, the heads of the two movements, the metapolitical movements, that is de Benoit and Spencer, are part of what I would call a very odd type of right, which is a kind of pagan revolutionary right, an anti-Christian, anti-Judeo-Christian revolutionary right. And so, you have this historically with some elements on the radical right. If you look, however, to radical right-wing populist parties in Europe, you have this element within the constituencies of the parties. So you have, for example, a pagan element in the Rassemblement National, but it sits side by side, that is the old Front National, with a more kind of Christian traditionalist right. And in a sense, it's very difficult, I would say, if you're on the right, to get the pagan right-wing tradition to be hegemonic. So that is, I would say that historically on the right, the more Christian tradition is hegemonic. And so that's why you would see amongst radical right-wing populist parties more a defense of the Christian heritage, for example, of the West. And a defense of Christianity as integral part of the nation. And so it's been a difficult struggle, in a sense, for elements of the radical right that are on this pagan wing to get their ideas to be accepted amongst ordinary voters, I would say. People would look at that and they would say, well, that's really weird, right? I mean, this is part of our heritage. This is part of our country. This is part of our nation. And, come along, Spencer and de Benoit and say, well, no, that's actually what's destroying your peoples. That's destroying your race. It's that egalitarianism inherent in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which, by the way, in that type of thinking was first brought by the Jews. So Spencer's very clear about that, but de Benoit has alluded to that in a 1981 article as well. Spencer's openly anti-Semitic, right? If you look at his manifesto, I just have it here, and I'm thinking, point number 2 of the manifesto is about the Jews. So he's clearly anti-Semitic, whereas de Benoit has steered clear of that question because I think he's very conscious of trying to create more of a new right.
I keep forgetting to unmute. So here we go. Thanks very much, Tamir. It looks like we're already 15 minutes over time. There are a few questions remaining, but I think we should probably bring the panel to a close now. Are there any final thoughts that panelists want to leave us with? If so, just keep it to a minute or so, just to wrap up. Any final thoughts? Tamir?
I just thank you guys for bringing this, Samir and the Institute, and the perspectives were so very different, and so I really learned from it myself, and so I hope people out there as well, and I thank you for doing this, and I look forward to the future conversations that you're going to have. Thanks very much, Tamir.
I would just echo that. Let's reconvene next Friday.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'll provide further details on that. Thank you, Ingo. Jaleh.
No, I have nothing to add. I very much look forward to next Friday and following conversations. I thought this was an amazing conversation. Thank you
very much. So at this stage, I'd just like to thank all the panelists for their excellent first contributions to the book. No book without contributors in this case. So thank you for that, and also thank you for your insights on this panel. I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in. It was great having you. Terrific questions. I'm sorry we couldn't answer all of them. Please come back in exactly 1 week, where we'll discuss theoretical approaches to fascism. And then the following week after that, we'll be talking about contemporary perspectives. I think both of these sessions are going to be really fascinating. So please do join us then. So again, 10 to 12 Pacific Standard Time. You register as you did this week. For the next sessions, you'll be sent links, etc. So thank you very much. Thanks again, panelists, and we'll see you all in a week. Goodbye.